So thank you for organizing the workshop. I'm just gonna jump in. I have an argument, but I don't really have a lot of research here. It's just a set of ideas. And I want to talk about the siege, how it failed, and what that tells us about the possibilities for the future inclusion of Gazans in a potential citizenship regime. Okay, where am I coming from with this? I have this idea that citizenship is not about, in our area, in Israel, Palestine, is not about rights, it's about mobility. It's about who can move where and when. And I won't go into that too much. If it interests anybody afterwards, we could talk about it, or I can send you stuff that I wrote about it. But what it basically looks at, and this is some other people have written about this, Nimr Sultani, Lana Tatur, have written about the way that actually the separation between Palestinians at different levels, be it East Jerusalemites, West Bankers, and Gazans, are kind of they're a sliding scale of mobility that also is the way they are included or not included within the one regime. So we have one regime that's ruling over all these different types of populations, and it's all about who can move where. Okay, now I'm going to jump to two things. I'm going to go into Gaza, but before that, I want to talk about the corona. Okay, so COVID, which was a new kind of civil emergency layered over the permanent security emergency that we have, did a really amazing thing. I'll talk first about the West Bank and then about Gaza. So in the first closure in March 2020, something happened. And for the first time ever, Palestinian workers were allowed to sleep in Israel. Not only were they allowed, they were made to sleep in Israel. So since 1967, they were absolutely not allowed to sleep in Israel because that was considered to be a security threat, because Palestinian laborers would create connections and life centers and residency if they slept legally in Israel. So what they had to do was go home between 1 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the morning, back to the West Bank, and that way they could be legal. Now we all know that there's so many illegal or illegal according to Israeli documents, Palestinian workers that were in Israel, but we're talking about the legal side. Now, why is it important to talk about who's legal and not legal? Because you can be legal, but it's very, very difficult. It's hard for you. And being legal means that you actually have a sense also of participation, of status, and standing. And this is important for us, because if we decide to stop thinking of citizenship as a legal category that's prescribed and then has a bundle of rights within it, then we start thinking of citizenship as practice. And that's why it's important if somebody's legal or not legal, if they have to hide or not. Okay. So 40,000, so March 2020, 40,000 Palestinian workers sleep in Israel for 2 months. And this was a major win of economic forces over the General Security Service, basically overturning this kind of blanket restriction on sleeping. So at that point, what starts happening is that this shift also happens with regards to Gaza. It takes longer to take place, but basically a siege of over 15 years in which literally Gazans moving is considered the major security threat, impossible, no contact policy, everything. It's just like, this is a terrorist state. You can't have any relations. Everyone's a ticking bomb. And this is like written in documents. Like, it's impossible to allow workers because they are ticking bombs. And then all of a sudden, COVID comes and there starts this shift. At first, it's kind of gradual. You have hundreds of people that have trade permits to enter. And then workers that I can give you the numbers here. End of 2021, there start being around 5,000 permits, and then it goes up to 15,000. But there are, from what the numbers show us, there are like over 35,000 Gazans that are coming into Israel with permits. De facto, it's the end of a siege. Okay, there still is the restriction on coming in. There's the surveillance and restriction on goods. There's all of that whole thing is in place, except there's no longer that restriction on movement. And what I think happened is this. There was a deep attempt, a real attempt, to disconnect Gaza from the West Bank, to disconnect Gaza from the discourse around what is going to be the future of the territory, to disconnect that population, to take 2 million people and say, you are not in the equation, you're not going to be part of any kind of arrangement at any point. And that fails. And that fails. And understanding the failure of the Israeli siege on Gaza, I think, is a very important point to kind of move forward. Now, you could say, what do you mean it failed? This situation is so terrible. It is. But remember, we're not looking at people's rights. We're looking at possibilities for mobility, what those possibilities mean, and what they create. This is very important. The fact that people can see themselves as part of. One of the things in research, we did some research on, this is with Omri Greenberg and Walid Habas. We did research on the Palestinians that were sleeping in Israel those 2 months of the corona. And immediately all conversations in these really crazy sites, they were under heavily controlled security, had no windows, people were in sleeping bags, but it was like being in summer camp. Like Walid Habas, he's a doctoral researcher at Hebrew University, and he says, you literally feel like everybody went out on a camping trip. Like it's just, and all the conversations were about one thing. What if, instead of having a permit of 3 months or 6 months, we had a permit for a year? What happens if we would be like foreign workers and we would have the same type of thing? Now you say to yourself, well, so what is this conversation? What is this conversation about? It's about the possibility to participate, to take part, to have some sort of control over life. It's not at all political participation as we know it. It's not about voting. It's not about running for elections, but it definitely is about having his status. And in this sense, what I want to say is that I think that if indeed this is the end of the siege, and again, it's the way Israel, this is not about optimism. I just want to make clear that this is not about me being optimistic, okay?
Despite appearances.
This is not about me being optimistic. I'm just trying to analyze the situation here.
There's the performative and there's the declarative here.
We're going to see a lot of performance in the future. And it's not going to be the end of the well. Sorry.
Listen. Wait. Okay. Okay. If it's the end of the siege, if the siege has failed, de facto, right? De facto, you have people moving. You have these people who were 5 minutes ago, they were ticking bombs. Wait, don't forget in 2000, before the Intifada starts, 26,000 Gazans have permits, but 500,000 Gazans are working in Israel. Okay? So the numbers is a different story than what actually happens. And so there is, you're right about the numbers. You say, okay, what's 15,000 permits to 2 million people? But it used to be that you had 25,000 legal permits and 500,000 people working and moving. Okay, so if it is indeed
that's practically how they do, because errors is literally
right,
like normal checkpoints.
for sure.
So how they could like
I don't know yet.
you don't.
I don't know. This is not a program. I'm trying to figure out what's happening and trying to read it differently than, oh, Israel has control when it allows the Palestinians to come out and work for economic reasons. There's other stories that happen with this. There's other processes that happen with this. And I'm trying to go with those processes and things, how they can be of benefit, both analytically and politically. That's the thing. So if indeed it's the end of the siege, and the siege failed, the question is, what would open up the most amount of possibilities for status, for participation, for taking part? Now, this is a very dangerous road to tread because of the push to make economic peace, which is something that both Palestinians and anyone who agrees or supports the right of Palestinian self-determination has to go absolutely against. Any kind of arrangement that is only economic and doesn't hold with it also a political shift. So we have this principle here, and then there's life, and then we have to see how that works out. And so what I'm thinking is the fact that there is no more binary of the security threat, right? So there is no actual security threat, the thing of the siege. People are moving, people are going. How does that become an opportunity to widen freedom of movement, widen participation, widen status, and also call it something? Because one of our biggest problems, and I'm sure Karine is going to talk about this afterwards, is we have a lack of terms for these kinds of things. We don't have a term for this kind of participation. We don't have a term for movement as something that allows more than just actual mobility for functional purposes. And that's one thing that I think would be helpful in relation to Gaza. I think I'll stop there. I have a few more ideas, but
very interesting. So it seems to me that we can talk about the idea whether this is the end of the siege, but I want to go with you, as a starting point, not ask a question about that. What I want to ask is really, what is the difference, the essential difference between what you're talking about and economic peace? Because it seems like another alternative argument that one could have raised is that there is a subversive aspect of economic peace that can be used against the economic model of integration in the market and no political participation. But you don't choose to go down that route. You choose to go down a different route and say that this is totally different from economic peace, as I understand you.
I can qualify that and say it's totally different than, for instance, the Trump or UAE plans for okay, let's, create more political opportunities and then Palestinians will stop wanting self-determination. I think that's what I'm saying. It's not that.
Okay,
but
so then my response is that the term economic peace has a rather long history, and within that history, there are very, very different iterations. And so it might be useful in further developing this thought, whether it becomes a project about Gaza or a different project, to ask whether there are, within that existing historical tradition, moments of a liberational or a potential of liberation, and where they occurred, and how can they be utilized or reinterpreted in a way that is consonant with your thinking about mobility and about a political participation from below, if I understand correctly.
Can I sort of piggyback on that question? And I mean, I missed part of the conversation while I was walking from Zoom to here. But I think another way of for me, asking Itamar's question is, what is the interface between what you just said and what we heard
Right,
from
right.
our previous,
Sorry, Zain.
yes. Because he was talking in terms that are very similar to yours and yet also very different to yours, right? So I think that there's a tension there that I would.
also say something just to add to these, as you think. I think you're talking about failure. And that's the value. That's some of the value of what you're saying, at least. That something failed.
The failure of the siege.
And there is a chance in the failure. There's
Yes.
some horizon to find beyond that failure. And so, I mean, I like the idea of looking at examples in the history of where you can go with this, but there's something that you're not saying, okay, we're just opening up. We're just opening up for more, because obviously this opening up is a restriction. There's going to be a restriction after the opening up. Every time there's going to be some security thing, it's going to close, right? That's going to happen. But you're talking about
I think what's really, it's funny because it's two different projects, right? It's like figuring out, okay, what actually happened? There's this moment, what happened in this moment of the end of the siege? Now, it's a little bit similar to, like, Itamar and I have been part of this group that's arguing that there's actually an annexation de jure going on right now because of the change in the authority regarding the civil administration and what's going on in the West Bank. And it's the kind of same thing. So nobody's standing there going, oh, okay, we ended the siege right now. There's this way of doing things through practice, be it making or undoing, that is very far from declarations. And I think that's what makes it so hard for international law, that is all about declarations and waiting for moments of declaration. And so international law is sitting there going, okay, they haven't declared it, so I guess it's not finished. But yes, on the ground, there it is.
They declared it and it's finished, right? They declared that it's finished.
Right.
2005.
Right. No, but there's something. So there's something there that allows that's the whole thing. We have to abandon the necessities or the mifchanim, the structures of the legal categories, or their content of the legal categories that we're looking for in order to be able to see new legal categories. And in that sense, it's very much along what you're saying. So economic peace, what does that actually mean in content?
Right.
And how is that different than self-determination?
Right.
Because it might be that getting on the bus and having your family and having your kids be able to stay and not wanting to leave all their life, that might be self-determination as well. I mean, it's a very sad way to look at things, and it's much less grandiose than, national self-determination, but it just might be the thing. So
I also think about the difference between economic peace and peace. That's another different history.
We have
Yeah.
Gadi Barzilai wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Yael. It was easier to meet in Lisbon than in Haifa, but so I have a question, might be not part of your research, and I also actually wanted to ask the previous speaker, but I was a bit reluctant. I didn't know how whether it would be appropriate, but I would like to ask you about Hamas. Because in a way, we are talking about the Israeli side, and obviously there are huge economic discrepancies between Israel and Hamas. But my question, Hamas was originally established as a social movement. And the question is, I don't know, it's not part of your research, whether Hamas is investing efforts in creating a local labor market with all the constraints and the siege. All of that is true, but the question is what Hamas is doing as a social movement to establish more economic possibilities to the local population, which shouldn't obviously make your lecture as important as it is, but it's not a purely neo-Kantian perspective. We have to put into the picture the conflict and what Hamas is doing or not doing in its own territories regarding creation of labor potentialities for the population.
So I can't talk about what Hamas is doing in Gaza. I can talk about the West Bank in this regard. So you have this relationship between opportunities that are created within and then the dependency on work in Israel. And this is a relationship that is very fraught for many reasons, because also, for instance, Palestinian Authority, there's parts of the Palestinian Authority that really want to prevent Palestinians from working in the settlements, for instance, which is a huge site of, Palestinian labor. So there have been many, many attempts to try and redirect the labor going into Israel back into the economy, and that those are usually not very successful, but they are successful. But the point is that I think that while that issue is important, it's an issue that is okay. It's about your paradigm. Is like, are you thinking of West Bank and Gaza as possible territories that will actually be separated at one point from Israel? Or do you think that that's an impossibility? And I'm of those people that see it as a one state, as one regime. In the future, I would be happy with different kinds of forms. At time, confederation is right now my preferred political arena, but I think that any other fully democratic, fully equal system would be good. I don't know how to get there. But what I'm saying is, I think your question is important, but it's only important, the extent of its importance is about how you see the regime itself.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Can I ask that? So you gave this really beautiful image of the COVID, there was crisis, and then they opened up because of economic pressure. So it's like economic, people calling for workers, right? Then we can't shut the building industry or something like that.
No, literally, there's a protocol in which the head of the Igud HaKablanim, I'm sorry that my English, the contractors union, and Itachdut HaTa'asiyanim, the industrialists, the big economic players sit there and say, if you do not let Palestinian workers in, Israeli economy will collapse. It's there.
Emergency rhetoric.
Yeah.
And they manage, and they
everywhere in the world they were talking like that.
Right.
The economy is so we have to do something.
But they managed to convince and overturn the Shabak's complete denial of it.
The continuation of the story was that there was these interviews going on in these spaces which were closed.
Yes.
So they were closed up in those building areas or in this industrial areas, whatever that was. And in those spaces, there was this further conversation about what's next. Like they're saying, maybe we can ask for a yearly permit.
Right.
So moving from one blockade to a different kind of closed space within an open space or whatever. And in it, people start to imagine. Now, on top of that, there is this logic of security, which is really that this crisis created an opportunity for this type of small closure within within Israel. And next time there's going to be a crisis, it's going to be another, a terrorist attack or rockets from Gaza or whatever. It will end.
End and open up. End and open up. So that's the thing.
Right.
I think that, and this is different. You can see it in the West Bank. It's not about the height of what's going on. It's not about the flame at all. It's about what the mindset is to declare on declaring closure. So you had periods where closure was declared for hundreds of days. And yet, when you look at the amount of violence, like recently in the recent months, there was just as much violence on some of those days, but there isn't closure because that's not the paradigm right now. And so I think with the siege, it's the same thing. I'm trying to think of it in that way, that it's the same thing. You can have the closure because it's a military dictatorship, and that's what it does. It's a military dictatorship whose power is closure and denial of mobility. That's its power. So obviously it's going to work that way. And then within that, we have to see the differences in forms of that power. And so I think like siege or closure as definitive, those are different things rather than, yes, okay, there was an attack, so we're going to close till tomorrow, then we're going to open up, then we're going to close it. It's a different, it's like a different set. And within that, we're thinking of the possibility for political shifts or to reorganize the ideas around participation.
I love the idea. First of all, I love the idea of theorizing failure and working through failure rather than against failure. I'm all for failure and not success. And I'm also, no. Well, obviously, it's the angst. But I think, and I also really like what you're trying to do by entering the gap between the performative and declarative, right? You're saying there's things happening, and while we're right, and what you guys wrote, and I think that there is a lot of potential for conceptualizing new modes of political organization, categories, what have you, in that gap, and I really like that program. But the problem is that once we're in that gap, we need to conceptualize it, right? We can't let it remain unconceptualized, if only because the Trumpists and the whatever accords and whatever they're doing, they're entering the exact same fray and they're reconceptualized. So we need to reconceptualize. But then this is where it gets tricky because we need new terms. We need new terms and we need to conceptualize these terms. Who's going to do this reconceptualizing, right? Who are we to do this reconceptualizing? Who are we to create these new categories vis-a-vis the Gazans? If we're, we could say, no, we're one big entity now, which I also tend to agree with. Then do you see what I'm saying? Who gets to call the failure? Who gets to call this new? There's a difference between us as academics theorizing these things and reconceptualizing them, and us entering the political arena and declaring them. Do you see what I'm saying? That the declarative is this political stand that I think needs that there are political problems with us as academics coming in and doing that declarative, doing that conceptualizing.
Okay, so here's what I see, how I see that. Figuring out what's going on is our job. Calling it various names that offer possibilities to understand what's happening is our job. Attaching possible action to what we think is happening and those strands is still our job. When is our job more difficult? Fraught. When it comes to the implementation of these things. We are at this point so far from anything resembling implementation that I do not think that question is an important one at this point. And what I mean by that is the question of representation is a huge important question, and that's why we are all Jewish Israelis, an American and Palestinian with Israeli citizenship all around this table, but it's very obvious what in what context of participation we are in, like and the difficulties of that. But I don't think at all this is only about Palestinian rights.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
Gaza is not only about Palestine, because Gaza is not separate from the West Bank or Jerusalem or Akka, Yafa, Haifa, everything. All this historic Palestine, historic Eretz Israel, all this stuff includes Gaza. And that's why it's important for us to do. So in that sense, maybe it's a cheap way to weasel out of it, but that's the way that's what I'm doing with it. I'm saying this is our job, and right now also we're very far from that. We do have to take responsibility for the concepts that we put out, for the potential effects are they used, but we're not at the point of implementation yet. And so
This was not meant to quash your project, quite the
No, it's
opposite.
okay.
It
It's
was
okay.
meant to
to
create a horizon also of things that we must take into consideration. So yes.
I have another thought, and maybe after that we can move to Karine unless anyone else wants to jump
And
in.
it's still in the same, mine is also in the same area.
Excellent. So I guess you kind of know these things that I forgot to say, but I think I want to say them anyway. So I think that if we look at actors that connect between these three categories of economic integration, peace, and self-determination, they're not as few as you may have suggested here. So, for example, here, I mean, there is this kind of history, as I said, in this area of economic peace that goes back to Paris, at least.
the British.
Yeah, to the British, of course, to the British. That's the most important.
Land of progress.
Yes. But I think, for example, in the context of labor advocacy, there are cases in the Supreme Court of issues that have to do with labor organization of Palestinian workers in the West Bank and settlements. And so I think it would be interesting to reread those cases and see what happened there exactly and how does it, if at all, relate to potentials of liberation. Ma'an has been leading that for years.
Amazing. Yes.
And
Ma'an.
it's a workers union, workers organizers organization that is very, very long-standing, but not extreme, but very small, and is related to the Dam party that you may have probably heard of.
And they've managed to like unionize Palestinian workers, which is pretty amazing.
And Mishol Adumim, Musachim, sorry. And the other history that is really relates between these three concepts in a it is related to an international law tradition, which is the European Union project, and this
Yes.
you know.
Yes.
So in the European Union, it was always the idea
Yes.
that the integration of markets is related closely to peace
Yes.
and related closely to self-determination as a European unity, the ever closer union, so-called.
Yes.
And so I think it would be very, very valuable. I don't know if it relates specifically to Gaza or more general to have a project of a kind of genealogy of economic peace in this area or in general. And it's there are obviously amazing
and
big parts of it that are
potential.
oppression, that are basically about oppression. But I'm not entirely clear that it's all the way down oppression.
Because peace also, without economy, has a history of oppression.
Right.
So
exactly.
that's
a very good
the
point.
kind of history I wanted to refer
it's
to when I said
extremely
not
good
only
point.
the economy is peace.
Economy without peace.
Not only peace and economy, but peace in itself. The history of that.
Right.
Economic
Wow,
peace.
great.
Okay,